an academic at Westminster University, but she's also, more importantly, an activist for Kashmir rights, speaks and campaigns on Kashmir a great deal, and also a creative artist and writer, novelist. She's many things.
I just want a few images in the background and just one other thing that I think which is a scroll article, because it's the only place I can think of where. Okay. So yeah, there's bits in it that I need to refer to. Alright. So it's assassination. It's the very fact that we that we have a sort of a repeated circle of assassinations of people for their views. It's something that that is an absolute travesty, and yet, I mean, just a few years on from Sabeen Mahmood, I remember not far, literally just across the road in Conway Square, there was a big event where people talked about Sabeen Mahmood's legacy and her work and the reasons why speaking truth to power can get one killed. And here we are, and in between, of course, in that part of the world, and as the politics gets worse, there are a number of people. Tista Seetalwad earlier talked about, murders of rationalists, atheists, and other dissidents, and those like Gauri Lankesh, who were seen to be a bigger threat because they write in regional languages and because they are able to reach to the people, and because the message that they have is powerful. On the day that Modi got elected in India in 2014, just shortly afterwards, there was the murder of a person. It was reported in the media as Pune Techie. The victim was reported as Pune Techie. In Pune, a person who worked ostensibly in some form in the technological sector. And the reason that he had been killed by those who killed him is because he was wearing a Muslim skull cap, and the idea was that the people picked him for that visible symbolism. It is important to remember at this point that this was exactly the symbolism that the Indian Prime Minister Modi refused to dawn on at any point during his campaign. That he explicitly said, I will not wear, later they found reasons, etc., why he would not. But the symbol that he refused to don on the day that, or shortly after that he and BJP got elected, a person was killed for exactly wearing that specific symbol. What is more, a few years down the line, we are at a situation where in a court judgment, I think earlier this year, there was a bizarre logic that the people who killed this man killed him because they were returning from a religious rally, and they were emotionally volatile or somehow provoked by the sight of somebody who was wearing this. The case is not yet finalized, but the judge gave bail to a few people based on this absurd logic. So the disposability of life of people in contexts like this, in what I think Tista quite rightly called, and I would agree, are what proto-fascist context, the disposability of life, and the way in which we see that in India now, is, to many people in Kashmir, they would say, well, we've been living in this kind of a situation for decades. So it's like when financial crisis happens in the West and everybody thinks, oh, well, economies can collapse. But when it's people dying elsewhere, it's just people dying elsewhere. So the point of this is, of course, not that this contrast should make us any less worried about what's happening in India, but to recognize that the very places which are seen as the states of exception, which are seen as the laboratories where these techniques of violence can be practiced and perfected, then eventually result in an importation of those same techniques back into the heartlands and the homelands. It doesn't have to be distant. It can be the people in the rural areas, the tribals, the people in the northeast, or people in Kashmir. But many of these things are not, if we look carefully enough, they're hiding in plain sight. I just wanted to show you an image. So you see, in a landscape which India would say is a democracy, and the elections are a festival of democracy. So this is a photo essay I did earlier this year. It was published on 15th August. So this kind of a visibly militarized landscape where you see weapons and people in uniform and implements of violence all around you, in that context, in a context where every time there is an uprising, including the last one, which was in 2016, people were fired at, protesters and others were fired at by pellets which blinded them. It was, large numbers of people lost their eyesight or were affected in other ways. There were blatant instances of for example, a lecturer in Crewe who was, he got into an argument with the armed personnel because he wanted to question their reasons for being there or for the checks and whether they had the authority to be doing the searches that they were doing. And for that, he was punished by being beaten to death. Somebody who was just saying, well, that's the sort of thing that you would normally expect to be possible to question and say, well, what's your authority for doing what you're doing? Or the ATM guard who was found pumped with pellets all over his body. So it's the utter disposability of bodies in these conflict zones in Kashmir specifically I'm speaking about, and the role of media. I mean, the very idea of we worry about media freedoms. We worry about media being compromised in a situation where you expect there to be something else happening at other points. But if we broaden the definition of media, well, even if we don't actually, but look at print media. So in 2016, newspapers were, during the uprising, the newspapers were prohibited from publishing, were banned. So there was this period in contemporary India where newspapers could not be printed in Kashmir. Kashmir Reader was banned. A human rights activist, a prominent human rights activist, Khurram Parvez, who was due to travel to Geneva and Switzerland to speak, was detained at the detained arbitrarily and then kept in custody for months. Earlier this year, and one of our PhD students, Amina, kindly found the name of this person because there are these endless cases. So this particular person who worked for Greater Kashmir newspaper, Kamran Yusuf, was taken into custody. So many of the, and I would also like to draw your attention to a book by Sanjay Ka. It's called Witness Kashmir, and it's a book that compiles the work of photojournalists in Kashmir. We had a launch of that earlier this year, and I was, it was a really good opportunity to speak to Sanjay about it and to get to a detailed discussion, which is also on YouTube. So if you Google with these words, on YouTube you will find that video. But it compiles from 1980s to 1986 to 2016, and it looks at over this period of time the work of 9 photojournalists and the sheer horror of it, as well as the international awareness of what's going on. So you have protests for Gaza happening in Kashmir, in the mid 80s. So so Save Gaza is a slogan that's there, but also the horrific massacres and the difficulties. And in that you also hear about the immense difficulties that are faced by journalists and photojournalists when they work in or during protests, which are not unusual. So when you are functioning in an arena which is that dangerous, and the risks to life as well as the utter lack of trust. So the photojournalists and journalists, both in the media people, stand to of course be at the arbitrary exercise of power by the authorities, but also from a protester point of view, sometimes their positionality can be really difficult. So the role of media is exceptionally difficult in those conflict zones, and several of the people in India who dissent would also recognize this in Kashmir. In fact, that all of these people would recognize why this is important and why we need to, if we are not silent about any injustice, then we recognize the complex ways and in which they are interlinked. Talking about social media, the gagging of social media is a default position for the authorities in Indian authorities in Jammu and Kashmir. So, in this case, it is specifically Kashmir because the telephones and everything else works differently in Jammu. So, in the valley, for example, in Kashmir Valley, it is possible simply to turn off people's internet. It is possible simply to turn off people's phones. earlier this year, and I mentioned that here and also in my other Al Jazeera article, literally you are on a street that it's just incredibly. I wonder if people in India can even imagine how that would be like. I wonder if many elements, including of the thoughtful classes in India, would even be able to imagine what it feels like to be just walking down the street and suddenly there's something that has happened. Generally, in this, the killing of a militant or a protest or something, and suddenly everyone. It's a form of perfectly enough number of times repeated form of collective punishment that you are just walking about, and it doesn't matter if you have a relative who's ill in hospital. It doesn't matter what your needs are, where your children are, what your neighbors are doing, what you are at. Your phone just becomes utterly useless. It's just a little box. It doesn't work, and you have to. And it was it was very, of course, as it happened to me as well. And I was just and it's a strange thing because everyone just then starts to immediately talk about, oh well, is that network gone too, and this other one too, and this other one too, and before you know it, the telephones are all off. Social media is obviously the easiest thing to ban, and often there are bans on the use of social media too. So this suspension, the arbitrary exercise of power, lies in creating these zones of exception and suspension where ordinary principles as we know it of humanity, democracy, etc., or freedom can just be arbitrarily suspended. Agamben would, what Agamben calls the states of exception, and what, in fact, since so much of modern day politics looks like early to mid 20th century right-wing fascism, then some of the theorists also of that time come to mind. Agamben's work takes us back to Carl Schmitt, the Nazi jurist and political theologian. His whole idea of politics is this existential self-other divide, and this idea that of a political theology. And what we see with Hindutva, with these extremists who now have so much power, is that they have a political theology of no wonder, when you look at their focus on, and I was trying to think of cleanliness, purity, order, vigor, the sort of it's not just accidental that the echoes between this and previous totalitarian systems that we have seen. The cleaning is a cleaning of anything that is deemed to be undesirable. And while that starts from a cleanliness campaign, it then goes on, the signifier of what is to be cleaned and what is undesirable becomes ever broadened, and then the undesirables include people who don't agree with you, people who might question you, people who don't look like you, people who have a different religion. And so that cleaning, what starts from these lauded projects of cleaning then become about cleansing, then become about literally killing off and exterminating populations. And as we know from many of those poems about when they came from and when they came for. So when they come for each of these groups, every other section of society is made to believe that it would not happen to them, that it's always somebody else who is being targeted for some other, for some other reason. But of course that net is gradually widened and eventually ends up defining more and more clearly the ideal normative person, which is a deeply patriarchal, casteist and idea of who this normative person of the Hindu nation is, the pure Hindu self, and everybody else just gets gradually being shown their position. And this is something that political theological projects of extremism aimed at totalitarian control of the state have in common. And in many of these cases, they resort to outright the militia and the extremists. They have weapons training. They resort to outright violence. But in many cases, even the due process of the law can be made to be so cumbersome that the process itself is a deterrent and a punishment. So it's for example, through and as Rana just mentioned, for example, through the use of surveillance, or the use of surveillance, or through just arbitrarily taking people into custody, making them go through the hoops simply to have their everyday rights. And you do that for long enough that itself becomes a punishment. The process is the punishment, and it's meant to also signal to other people that if you ask questions, if you ask difficult questions, this could happen to you. If we can do this with a human rights defender who is internationally well known, etc., and we can make this person's life hell for this many months, if we can stop this newspaper, if we can get the speaker in, again, state legislature in Kashmir to change the rules for what journalists can cover when we are talking about the goods and services tax, which also happened earlier this year, then we can. If we can exercise power in these systematic, arbitrary ways, then we can do this to other people too. So it is an exercise of violence and of the that we ignore, that if we don't see the interconnections, we ignore that at our peril. Apologies, it comes from being too tired. The thing of Pune Techie, the murder, the assassination of that man, was not only because of the Modi skull cap example. What I wanted to say was that the murderers, the gang of people that killed him on that day, boasted the first wicket has been taken. And that was like in 2014 when Modi was elected. And so this idea that they see a coherence and a reason to why what is happening. The very fact that the first wicket has been taken, they see this as a project which is unfolding and which, as the rest of us have seen, is unfolding over the subsequent years as people are being targeted. And that this is not fringe. I can't imagine how, for the longest period of time, liberals have had this idea that these are just fringe figures. Yogi Adityanath is just a fringe figure. These people are just extremists. They never really have any power. They are not fringe figures. That person who was in 2015, when I wrote this, was, at the time of that Ram Madhav interview, he was a fringe figure. BJP is really about development. These are just fringe people. Now that fringe person is heading the most populous state and is being touted as the next Modi to Modi. So it's, the next guy. And of course, with that kind of politics, the worry, the desperate outcome, of course, is that it just becomes worse and worse. It's like the center keeps shifting, and then Modi gets seen in the way that that Modi is actually liberal compared to Adityanath. In the way in which people now think, oh, the Bushes were not so bad. Forget about the Iraq war and all of that. At least they weren't Trump. So it depends what we are using, how we are framing the comparison. I'm just trying to see if there's anything else that I absolutely... Their use of morality, true pure Hindu nation, the communalizing of Jammu and Kashmir, which is a key part of it. And in the way in which the society, economy and culture is all sought to be appropriated. So it's a very good combination of social conservatism. It's a kind of extremism that is comprised of social conservatism, like back to our old values, economic neoliberalism, because of course a lot of this is economic neoliberalism, even that not strictly the case because it's not even neoliberal. Many neoliberals these days are actually crony capitalists, so they are not, they just even pretend to be neoliberal. It's not even about the free markets. It's about a very strong state that's acting in the interests of specific kinds of actors, as with Trump in the US. And of course the Hindu fundamentalism and Hindu supremacism. But the other point, I think there is one other page that I had marked where I had something that I wanted to tell you, which is, yes, so what do we do? We know that there is everyday structural violence, which is already so high in post-colonial societies, where people are just die from a whole range of things that the state just isn't accountable to have to produce. And now we see an authoritarian, undemocratic, totalitarian, I guess I was just writing all the names, all the words, neoconservative, racist, revanchist, centralizing state, which is curbing media freedoms, which sees even the presentation of facts, as in the Jay Shah case, even the mere presentation of facts as being so dangerous. Of course, there's the recognition that saying anything in Kashmir makes it seditious and anti-national. But like even just showing somebody's economic worth going from 50,000 rupees to God knows how many millions is seen as problematic. So there is all of that, the wider background context, and I don't know if you said you were trying not to be too pessimistic, and I'm going to try doing that right now and not be too pessimistic, because when one thinks about the fates of dissenters in authoritarian regimes, history doesn't tell us a very kind story anyway. So I don't know, and part of the really difficult thing is the way in which this ties in with the global story of these non-Western places, which on the one hand are now claiming their rightful place in the sun. So it's like, you know, rising, whatever, we are finally. So it's a response to a kind of colonial, racist sort of view in international relations, which has existed for the longest period of time. So it's like, well, you know, this is a sort of a payback to that. So there's that, coupled with the economic crises in the West, which make it possible for many actors to just disregard this kind of violence. I mean, why aren't more people here thinking about the parallels between the US, India, Turkey, and specifically Modi and Trump? I mean, it's just, I don't know how do we stop that from happening again, except that we just have to be as loud as we can and the work that, you know, that you do. But I don't know, I mean, how does one speak truth to power at the, you know, at the barrel of a gun? It's just so dangerous for all these people who even, I was reading about this, journalists who file RTIs on land acquisitions, you know, any kind of corruption they uncover, and they're murdered. Vyapam scam has been going on for a while, and people being killed for a while. And the work of activists is key in all of this. But I don't know if we can, you give us hope. That's all I can say.